Israel bombs a school in Gaza, killing more Palestinians as the US's top diplomat Antony Blinken visits the region. He says talks in Egypt may be the last chance for a ceasefire in Gaza, but Hamas accuses the US and Israel of delay and adding new conditions. So can there be a breakthrough? This is Inside Story. Hello again, I'm James Bays. Efforts towards a ceasefire agreement in Gaza are ongoing, along with Israel's killing of Palestinians, with more victims after an airstrike on a school. While Israel sustains its violence with American support and weapons, Israeli officials are in Egypt, which is hosting more talks brokered along with Qatar and the US. The UN Security Council voted for a ceasefire back in June, but Israeli bombardment continues, the Palestinian death toll rises, Israeli captives remain in Gaza, and the risk of a wider regional conflict remains. So what are the hopes for progress despite all this? And is Israel's Prime Minister really interested in a deal? We'll be analysing the prospects with our panel of distinguished guests shortly, but first, this report from Kulsum Sharif.
Another day of bloodshed in Gaza. The Israeli military killed at least 35 Palestinians on Monday. For months now, Palestinians have been pleading to the international community to do more to get a ceasefire. But there's been no let-up in Israeli raids and airstrikes, forcing already displaced people to move again as many suffer hunger and disease. With the humanitarian situation worsening, US Secretary of State Antony Blinken is optimistic about a ceasefire deal, saying Israel has accepted what he called a bridging proposal. In more than 10 months of Israel's war on the Strip, Blinken has made a similar number of visits to the region to try and get an agreement. This time, he says he hopes to push a deal over the finish line. The top US diplomat says he's spoken to Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, and it's now up to Hamas to agree.
In a very constructive meeting with Prime Minister Netanyahu today, he confirmed to me that Israel accepts the bridging proposal, that he supports it. It's now incumbent on Hamas to do the same. And then the parties, with the help of the mediators, the United States, Egypt, and Qatar, have to come together and complete the process of reaching clear understandings about how they'll implement the commitments.
Hamas and Israel had agreed in principle to implement a three-phase framework proposed by US President Joe Biden in May. But that deal collapsed after Netanyahu is said to have made new demands.
We don't need more negotiations. We need to agree on an implementation mechanism. When Blinken says the Israelis have agreed, and then the Israelis say that there is an updated document, that means that the American administration is giving in to the Israeli pressure and not the opposite.
The US has not provided details about the bridging proposal, and Israel and Hamas have differed on some issues. These include Israel's continuing presence in Gaza and the rights of displaced Palestinians to move from north to south. The latest talks come as fears grow of a wider regional war. Iran says the US is not qualified to be a mediator.
The US is a full-fledged supporter and permanent ally of Israel's criminal regime, and has repeatedly stressed its commitment to Israel's security. So far, the US has proven itself to be on the side of the country that is waging wars and committing crimes, rather than on the side that is capable of achieving a ceasefire in Gaza.
Israel's war on Gaza has killed more than 40,000 Palestinians since October. And the first case of polio in 25 years signals a worsening health crisis in the Strip. Kulsum Sharif, Al Jazeera, for Inside Story.
Well, let's bring in our guest to discuss all of this further. In London, we have Professor Yezid Sayigh. He's a senior fellow at the Malcolm H. Kerr Carnegie Middle East Centre and was an advisor and negotiator on the Palestinian delegation to peace talks with Israel in the 1990s. In Chicago, Akbar Shahid Ahmed is a senior diplomatic correspondent at HuffPost who covered US policy on Gaza since the Obama administration. And in London, Daniel Levy is president of the US Middle East Project and a member of the Israeli delegation to peace talks with Palestine in the late 1990s. So we have two of you who are former mediators and negotiators and a journalist in Chicago where that convention is taking place to give us the US electoral dimension to all of this. Daniel, let me start with you. US Secretary of State Antony Blinken, 9th trip to the region since October the 7th. We'll look at all the possible details of a deal in a moment, but perhaps let's sum up how things feel at the moment. Are you optimistic that there can be a deal?
James, I think on this 9th visit of Secretary of State Blinken, he is developing a talent for mediating between the competing camps inside the Israeli system. Blinken is not quite there. You still have the Prime Minister's office and parts of the defense establishment frantically briefing against each other in terms of Netanyahu's mandate not allowing a deal. Similarly, with the Prime Minister's office and the families of the hostages, they keep coming out and saying Netanyahu is torpedoing a deal. And, you know, that would be a joke, but it's not, because it's humiliating to American diplomacy and there are lives at stake. Of course, the Israelis being held in Gaza, but the tens of thousands of Palestinians who've been killed, the hundreds of thousands displaced, sent from one not safe zone to another. And unfortunately, James, I think what we have here is a couple of things. First of all, Netanyahu is now in a familiar place. It's a comfort zone that he knows well, that he can play along with the Americans because he has them where he wants them, which is that they will place blame on the other side. During Oslo, you could always blame Arafat. Now one can always blame Hamas. Some of those American officials later go on to write books where they acknowledge we were being Israel's lawyer. And what he has done, Blinken and the American system, is to take a Hamas willingness in late May to say, wait a minute, there might be an opening here. Are you really saying that the first phase is the on-ramp to a permanent ceasefire? The Israelis didn't want that. Netanyahu shot that down, and they've rewritten their own proposal so that it again becomes an Israeli proposal. And so this is more of an exercise in, first of all, trying to manage the avoidance of escalation in the region as the US deploys more military to the region. It is also telling Iran the threat has increased and don't torpedo these talks because we're spinning this positively. Okay, and as an aside, the US wants Israel to have freedom of military operation, so that's part of the game. And at the same time, it's trying to manage the electoral political news cycle, especially during this week of the convention in Chicago. I fear that is what's going on, and that Gaza, the people of Gaza, still rank a very distant third. Secretary Blinken could not even bring himself, when he gave that press briefing, to say this is about the people in Gaza and to stop the killing. He said there are two dangers. One, it gets more complicated. Two, more hostages are killed. Can you really, after all this time, not show any humanity towards Palestinians? The answer from Secretary Blinken is no.
Yezid, let me bring you in with a quote from Secretary Blinken when he was speaking. He says, this is a decisive moment, probably the best and maybe the last opportunity to get hostages home, to get a ceasefire and to put everyone on a better path to enduring peace and security. Do you think this is the best deal, he says, and do you think this is the last chance, which he also said, although later when he gave another news conference, he seemed to back down on that a bit?
Frankly, I find it sort of somewhat irrelevant to look at the detail of this word and that word, partly because we've heard this kind of talk from Secretary Blinken in the past, the best deal, the last chance. It's been the last chance for the last something like 9 months now, from once the United States adopted the idea of a ceasefire at all. Let's recall that in the first month of the war, the US was adamantly opposed to any mention of the word ceasefire, and people who called for a ceasefire were deemed to be, surrenderists. So I really don't take this kind of rhetoric seriously. I think what was more striking, though, in the clip you showed there in your video of Secretary Blinken, is we've not actually heard from Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu an explicit statement of acceptance of the ceasefire proposal. What we get from Secretary of State Blinken instead is that Netanyahu, first he said has accepted, then he said supports the proposal. Vague wording, which I think leaves us wondering whether Netanyahu actually, is going to come out and endorse what Blinken just said. I think we've, again, this is like watching a movie you've seen many, many times before and watching it once again in the hope that somehow the ending will be different. So I think Daniel Levy put it very well, that the US is simply playing this game where Israel gets to set conditions, change conditions, move the goalposts, and then the US comes along and blames Hamas for the outcome. I'm not exonerating Hamas in any way for a lot of things, but on this particular point, what I really want to leave you with is the idea that this whole ceasefire process, once the idea of endorsing a ceasefire was more or less forced on the Biden administration after October last year, it then sort of weaponized the ceasefire talks process as yet another means of deflecting diplomatic pressure on the Israeli government, deflecting responsibility for what was going on in Gaza from the far-right parts of that Israeli government and from Prime Minister Netanyahu himself, to becoming yet another endless process, such as the peace process was or has been for the last 25 years. We're still told, even today, by Israeli officials, that things like taking Israel to the International Criminal Court or the International Court of Justice will somehow derail the peace process. And there's this mythical peace process. We're now looking at another mythical process of a ceasefire negotiation, which I think this US administration could actually create a breakthrough by putting real pressure on the Israeli government. It's not willing to do that. And therefore, we have a situation where the US administration is basically killing time until the presidential election in November. And of course, Netanyahu is totally consciously biding his time until that election as well. So I think there will be no ceasefire between now and then, and we'll be lucky to get one even after.
Daniel, Yezid there said, which I think is important, that Blinken says they've got these bridging proposals they agree on, and Netanyahu's statement didn't say that. There was an admission. He didn't say he actually signed up to these proposals. And I think it's worth reminding our viewers that way back in May, when President Biden came up with his original proposal, and then Israel put down new conditions, that was presented to us as this is an Israeli proposal.
As I said, and I would endorse all that Yezid said, as I said, the Israelis are still largely negotiating with themselves, and America is inserting itself into that mediation. There is another party to this. There is no reason to believe the battlefield balance of forces would not suggest this, that Hamas will simply accept any Israeli-American diktat. They're not in a position to do that. And as Yezid said, one can have issues, and one does, and one should, with things that Hamas have done and said. But the fact that they actually come to this with positions that will need to be realized, and that some of those positions are important and legitimate, cannot be lost. And right now, it's not just that Blinken is misleading us, and that gulf between what Blinken says and Netanyahu says should tell you everything. But it's not just deceit. This is also dangerous because it feels like the Americans and Israelis are dancing on the edge of a cliff where the extent of this deception and dishonesty from the Americans may achieve the opposite to what they desire, because it may increase the appetite of the axis of resistance forces to get re-engaged. And when you create an expectation and the expectation is dashed, that is dangerous in itself. So they really are not only doing a shame to diplomacy, but I don't see how they're serving the American interest ultimately either.
Let me bring you in, Akbar, because you've been covering these negotiations and this diplomacy since October the 7th and every twist and turn. You're now, though, in Chicago, also covering the Democratic Convention. So first, how big a deal is Gaza and what's going on to those people who are in Chicago right now? How high up is it on the agenda of conversation there? And what are your views on the electoral calculations that are going on with regard to these negotiations?
Thanks, James. I think there's a willingness to talk about Gaza. There's a willingness to even talk about Palestinian human rights and the protesters who are here in their thousands, right? And the delegates from the uncommitted movement, which represents hundreds of thousands of people who said, we're not going to support the Democratic ticket if we don't get some kind of progress on the Gaza war, on Israeli-Palestinian peace. All of that said, we're at a place where Democrats don't want to be talking about this, right? And so the veneer of the peace process is sort of enough. There's a real appetite here to say Gaza is relevant, great, we'll get a ceasefire when we get a ceasefire. But in terms of actual pressure and an impetus, I think for a lot of senior Democratic Party officials, given the rise of Kamala Harris, given the sense of jubilation, the sense of being forward-looking, they don't want to be talking about this. You saw President Biden last night. I was watching him from the convention center say, look, this war has gone on too long. We believe too many people have been lost on both sides. And that's an important message. I think that's a sufficient message for kind of the core of the Democratic Party, just to say, I acknowledge all sides, and that's it.
But Akbar, can I bring in one aspect of this? Because the engine of the protests in the US, the way I see it, has been the students. And of course, we've had academic holidays for recent weeks, and those campuses are all about to reconvene. We're going to have universities and colleges across the US, and we're going to see those protests again, aren't we? Is this not going to be worrying for the Harris campaign?
Correct. And I've been talking to student organizers who are coming to Chicago, who are preparing for the return to campus later this month and beginning of September. They want protests to be not only as big as they were in April at the end of the last academic year, they want them to be bigger. So I think that, yes, is a concern for the Harris campaign. There's a very deliberate effort, though, right, to cast protesters, whether it's students, whether it's protesters for Palestinian lives, to say that they're extreme, to say that they're radical, say they don't represent people, which is not, I don't think, is an accurate representation of those movements. But unfortunately, there's a degree of cynicism on the political front here that makes it easy to make those claims about protesters. All of that to say, would President Biden, would Vice President Harris love to have a ceasefire, love to have an agreement? Absolutely. It would be a diplomatic coup. They could turn around and say, look, we've brought home hostages, we've given something to the Israeli side and the Palestinian side. But given the complications of Israel-Palestine in the US political discourse, particularly given the concern that many Democrats have, including Vice President Harris's team, of being seen as insufficiently supportive of Israel, I don't see them being right now in a place to pressure Israel or wanting that. And I understand for many viewers outside the US, they could say, well, the US has given the Israelis tens of billions of dollars of weapons, 10 months to prosecute their war in Gaza. How could they possibly, as Democrats, feel they could be seen as not pro-Israel enough? And what I'd say to that is it's such a unique political context. I think the paranoia around that, the concern around being seen as abandoning a U.S. ally in the Middle East and this unique U.S. ally in the Middle East is kind of unimaginable. It's hard to overstate. So right now, Gaza is coming up at the convention, but it's coming up to a degree of, aren't we glad that President Biden is here supporting the Israelis and supporting diplomacy? There's not a real appetite to get into details, like why is there not a deal yet? Why are the Israelis sort of stalling on issues like the border of Gaza with Egypt? That kind of conversation, especially in this mood here of jubilation, turning the page from former President Trump and also President Biden, is not top of mind.
OK, Yezid, I'd like to take it back to the talks. We've got Secretary Blinken in the region, but he's not actually the negotiator. That is the CIA chief, Bill Burns, from the US, and it's the same team in this negotiation. The Qatari Prime Minister, the head of Egyptian intelligence, we expect the head of Mossad. But of course, although it's not always been direct negotiations, Hamas has not always been in the room, there is one of the negotiators missing. And that's an important element as they're trying to have negotiations, isn't it? That 3 weeks ago, Hamas's chief negotiator was assassinated. That creates a very bad faith situation to begin with.
Well, of course it does. But the real question nonetheless will remain whether Hamas feels that any ceasefire proposal put on the table delivers its minimum needs or addresses its basic concerns. And clearly the issue of having a permanent ceasefire is crucial for, in Hamas's view, ending Israeli military presence inside the Gaza Strip is also obviously very important. And so in a way, it doesn't really matter who represents who, so long as whether it's the Qataris, the Egyptians, or anyone else, what concrete proposals are put on the table. Now, again, I'll repeat that I think that in a way, unfortunately, this entire discussion is moot, because I do not think that Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has the slightest intention of actually accepting any ceasefire proposal, regardless of who has put it on the table, including himself. I mean, bluntly, the politics don't add up. Mostly for domestic political reasons, Netanyahu has an interest in not reaching an end to the combat in Gaza, so long as he is in potentially a vulnerable position at home and could be, taken to court on corruption charges, etc.
Okay, I take that point, but I would like very quickly just to go through some of these new conditions that Netanyahu has placed and whether there's any way they can be solved. First, we go right down to the bottom of the Gaza Strip on the border with Egypt, the Philadelphia corridor. That's a buffer zone. It's 14 kilometres long. Daniel, Israel took control of that in May against the Israeli-Egyptian long-standing peace agreements. Is there a way to sort this, do you think? I've heard some in the UN and EU say there's still an EU border assistance mission, not just on paper, it still has a budget and it has some staff. Is that a possibility? Could the Palestinian Authority run that buffer zone? What's your thoughts on that?
Well, of course there's a way of resolving that. And in fact, the US position throughout almost the entirety of events since October 7th was that Israel would have to withdraw from Gaza. In that respect, although the Biden administration would hate to ever and wouldn't ever acknowledge it, the Hamas and the US position substantively is closer. And there's always room for constructive ambiguity and compromises. But, and this is the crucial thing, that is, if there is a desire to get over the finishing line and if there is a credible mediator who can, to a significant enough degree, be trusted by both parties. The US, which is primus inter pares here, I'm not in any way insulting Egypt or Qatar to acknowledge that they are not equals in this. The US has proven and insisted that it cannot be trusted as a mediator. And just as crucially, if not more so, Netanyahu has made it abundantly clear at every opportunity that he is not interested in reaching a deal. And therefore, it doesn't matter what the clever, original ideas are. Netanyahu looks at the ledger. He looks at the cost-benefit equation when it comes to continuing the war versus putting an end to the war. He sees coalition, potential collapse, lots of difficulties on one side. He also sees that he is trying to resuscitate himself politically by asserting that he is the quintessential wartime leader for Israel. You need war to be able to make the claim that you're the necessary wartime leader. So that's this side of the equation. On the other side of the equation, yes, we have the ICC, we have the ICJ, we have the marches, we have the criticism. What we don't have is the country with the most leverage on Israel being willing to deploy that. That is obviously the US. The weapons without which he could not prosecute this war keep flowing. The America's allies are in lockstep. And those who also have trade and other relationships with the US and Israel are not willing to deploy those. And therefore, it's almost a no-brainer for Netanyahu. The Biden administration was set up to give Israel impunity long before October 7th to run cover for apartheid, and they have done a damn good job of that and a terrible job of everything else.
OK, let me bring in Akbar again in Chicago. Akbar, you heard Daniel, and Yezid has, I think, made the same point. The US has leverage. It's not using it. Is there any difference here with the Harris team and the Biden team? The Vice President's National Security Advisor, Phil Gordon, he looks like the main player on her foreign policy. Do you think there is any willingness from the Harris side to be tougher on Israel?
There is a willingness, based on my sources in the administration, from the Harris team. Phil Gordon, who you mentioned, some of her other advisors, like Ilan Goldenberg, who's now going to be her liaison to the American Jewish community, there is a willingness to consider steps like sanctioning even Smotrich and Ben-Gvir, these extremist ministers in the Israeli government. There's an openness to a degree that there hasn't been. And just the basic reality of not having President Joe Biden, someone who is, even by historic standards, more pro-Israel than other Democrats, that could be a difference for the Harris foreign policy. I think there's been a desire by kind of pro-Palestinian voices, but also others in the party. I think there's many Democrats who see this not just as politically complicated, but as strategically not beneficial to the US, right, in terms of a long-term destabilization of the region, in terms of affecting the US's view as a mediator, as an influential player. So you've seen Senator
just to bring Yezid in at the end, we're here talking about all of this diplomacy, and it's very, very grim because none of you think it's going anywhere. And of course, we're not talking about the people of Gaza and the situation there. Over 40,000 dead. Polio has now arrived. I think a thought from you at the end, Yezid, about the people who are in all this.
That's the most horrifying part of all this. We're talking about a territory that is tiny and that has basically become unlivable. The most recent reports talk of 42 million tons of rubble. We're talking about thousands of tons of ordnance that's in there that will take years to clear for anything to be safe, for rebuilding, for farming. This is basically a territory that cannot survive anymore on its own means. And, I think this is actually unprecedented. We can think of many disasters around the world, failed states, whatever you want. I don't think we know of anything like this, where a border is sealed off and an entire population is sealed within without the means to live. Clean water, farming, food, nothing. The population of Gaza has become totally dependent on world aid, and not for the next 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 years, but I think for decades to come, so long as the politics don't change that reality, that is of free, open access to the rest of the world, to markets, to the means of life.
Well, thank you very much. It was a fascinating but very grim conversation. Thanks to our guests, Yezid Sayigh, Akbar, Shahid, Ahmed and Daniel Levy. Coverage of both the ongoing diplomacy and the war on Gaza with our team on the ground, and their extensive reporting continues on Al Jazeera with analysis too at aljazeera.com. We welcome your comments. Find us at facebook.com/AJ Inside Story or on X. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, James Bays, and the whole team here in Doha. Please stay safe. I'll see you back here very soon. Bye-bye for now.
Make sure to subscribe to our channel to get the latest news from Al Jazeera.